This year marks a century since the Anzac landings at Gallipoli. And a few days ago, the nation again paused to mark Remembrance Day. It wasn't long ago historians believed Anzac ceremonies and war commemorations were withering away, but they couldn't have been more wrong. In cities and towns around Australia, local memorials remain the focus for tributes, as John Taylor reports.
It's called the Weeping Mother. It was erected in Gatton, in Queensland's Lockyer Valley in 1922, built and paid for by the small community. It was and is an expression of sympathy with the mothers of fallen soldiers. Right across Australia, you'll find memorials from the centre of cities to the edges of villages. They're often overlooked in the hustle and bustle of daily life, but at the right moment, they still have a majesty and a power.
War memorials don't praise war, they honour people.
Memorials remain a complicated reminder of life, service, loss and love. And similar forces that led to their creation in the past are driving the unveiling of new memorials today.
It's something that represents their sacrifice and their commitment to their country that was never acknowledged.
This is believed to be the first memorial built in Australia. It pays tribute to the men of the 99th Regiment of Foot who served in conflict against Maori in the colonial New Zealand Wars. The earliest conflicts on Australian soil, frontier wars with Indigenous Australians, went unrecognised.
And I would say that that is because that doesn't grant you any kudos internationally. That doesn't say anything much about your development as a nation. It has, or indeed a colony. It has to do with what you have sent forces to do, where you have gone to do things, not necessarily with how you have settled the lands which you see as your own.
This memorial in Queanbeyan was erected in 1903, on the King's birthday for local men who signed up to fight on behalf of Britain in the Boer War. It was also one of Queanbeyan's first gas lights. Memorials do get moved because communities change. Country tracks have become busy roads. But it was World War I that would see the old mourn the young in memorials across the Australian landscape. Even before the Great War had finished, honour boards were hung, war's end uncertain. Stone came later, but earlier than you might think. Here's the Governor-General of Australia, Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson, unveiling a Gallipoli obelisk in South Australia on the 7th of September 1915. Anzac troops were still dying on the peninsula. It stands today, although it has been relocated. But it was after war's end that most grieving communities erected their monuments.
The community did that very spontaneously. That was their own reaction to this conflict and again to the fact that they didn't have a grave at which to mourn.
It's important to realise that men were still dying. Almost 62,000 Australians died in the First World War, but another 60,000 would die within a decade of returning home. In the anonymity of mass slaughter and having no body to bury, names anchored the dead to the living. Australian memorials don't just name the dead, they also include those who served.
That probably has a lot to do with, in this country, with our own interest in our ancestry. There's always been a desire, and I suppose being a reasonably small nation, a capacity for us to record the names of everyone who has served and died.
Memorials then and now are all different. Some modest, some grand.
And when I looked, it had a false bottom in the fishing creel, and in the bottom were these diaries of his. He had never mentioned those to me before.
You'd be hard-pressed to find a couple who visited more war memorials than Toowoomba locals Trevor and Shirley McIver.
Very special tea towel that we were given from the War Nurses Memorial Park in Bundaberg.
A deep interest began in the 90s when Trevor was badly injured at work and they looked for places he could go in a wheelchair. From there, they decided to make a pictorial record of memorials, driving more than 40,000 kilometres across Queensland to photograph them.
We said it wasn't meant to be an in-depth study, it was a photographic record by two ordinary people honouring ordinary people who are the ones that virtually go and fight the wars.
They were staggered by how many there were, and they helped, in a way, rediscover a War Nurses Memorial in Bundaberg that had become largely overlooked. And so Shirley and Trevor, it's sort of fitting, isn't it, that in your own house you've actually got your own memorial?
Well, that's pretty right, yes.
Now, do your friends and family think you're a little eccentric about all the stuff about war memorials? Well,
They're used to it now.
We don't ask them.
This was my dad.
Right.
And these are original Anzacs. That's in the Governor-General's office at Yarralumla.
So which one's your dad?
This one here. He was looking at me taking a photo instead. I'm over here.
The man in the picture is George Jamieson, Shirley's father, who landed in the first wave at Gallipoli, fought through the war despite being wounded 11 times and won a military cross for bravery. He gave his son-in-law some relics which started his collection.
Even a live hand grenade of all things, he insisted was safe, and it was not. And I gave it to the regimental sergeant made it from Oakey Base out here, and they had to blow it up.
Trevor, do you think we'll ever know how many memorials there are in Australia?
I don't think you will, because they're still putting them up.
And not just to humans. This memorial was dedicated in 2012, 2 years after a fatal blast in Afghanistan. Sapper Darren Smith was the first military working dog handler to be killed in action while working his explosive detection dog, Herbie, on the battlefield.
That's to do with the way our culture is developing. Our culture is one in which pets and animals are very much loved and part of the community, and I think it's reasonably natural that our thoughts start to extend beyond just those servicemen and women who are in harm's way, but also others who perhaps, without being asked or invited, are also being put in harm's way. So animals were probably a fairly natural step in our community today.
And on some war memorials, not everyone even served. I'm not sure if you could call this an official war memorial, but it feels like it. And every Anzac Day in Brisbane, people gather here, in part to remember an 11-year-old boy called Hector Vasili. In June 1918, he was cheering a welcome home parade of Australian troops when he was struck by a passing vehicle and killed. Memorials to Indigenous servicemen and women are few and far between and relatively recent. This memorial was unveiled at Burleigh Heads on the Gold Coast in 1991, honouring the men and women from the Yugambeh family groups who served. Despite discrimination, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have fought for Australia from the Boer War to Afghanistan. More than 1,000 Indigenous soldiers served in the First World War, even though they weren't wanted.
Yeah, on paper there was a statement from the government that it was neither necessary nor desirable that persons not of substantially European descent should be enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force. Now, that was the instruction at the beginning of the war. Even then, there were recruitment officers who would turn a blind eye to that particular instruction, and so we have Asian Australians as well as Indigenous Australians enlisting from the very earliest days of the war, but sometimes they had to be very persistent. They had to go around quite a few places before they arrived at somebody who said, yes, you're willing to serve, therefore we're willing to take you on.
For Indigenous and Torres Strait Island people to be so proud to find a way to go to war when they weren't actually accepted for their own cultures, like, they should be very proud of themselves, and even their grandchildren should be proud of what they've achieved and what they've done for their country. Okay, I've just got some memorabilia from my time in the Army over 20 years.
And what's this? This is your...
That was my very first Army ID.
Did you know what you were getting yourself in for?
Not really, but I had a wonderful career. To Headquarters Northern Command.
Lorraine Hatton is a proud Quandamooka woman from North Stradbroke Island. She enlisted in 1986, serving around Australia and overseas, including in Afghanistan, before discharging in 2007 as a warrant officer, Class 2. After 2.5 years of effort, the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Dedicated Memorial Committee, which she's part of, is close to success.
I think it's important that we honour our Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island servicemen and women, past, present and future. And the fact that we're going to erect a memorial that will stand the test of time, really, forevermore.
It's emotional stuff.
Very emotional.
The proposed site is here, Brisbane's Anzac Square.
Because this memorial is dedicated to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples in Queensland, we think that Anzac Square in Brisbane would be the most suitable place.
4 small models will go on display in the city in December for a few months, with the best to be chosen. And then the fundraising will begin.
The memorial is looking at being erected approximately mid-August 2018. That's our target date. So, yeah, we have a lot of work to do.
The camera goes to war. Each day it records the courage and heroism of our troops in battle. But rarely do you see the camera and the men behind it who risk those same dangers to send back their stories and pictures.
The latest war memorial unveiled in Australia is this one, the War Correspondence Memorial. Again, it's unique, marking the achievements and sacrifice of those who've reported war.
War correspondents, of course, are an unusual feature because they stand outside the military community as a rule. They're not serving members of the military, but their job is to record and report what the military are doing for the people of the nation.
It was a solemn occasion, and the unveiling of memorials always has been. Across Australia, as memorials have been dedicated, time and again, people have seen in them a significance beyond stone, metal. Communities have rallied. People have gathered for fine words and silence. The focus point for sorrow, pride and respect. And perhaps a place for people to wonder why and what might have been.
The men who enlisted in this march knew what had happened at Gallipoli, knowing the casualty figures, knowing how many had been killed, how many had been maimed. They were still prepared to go, and I would call them the ultimate volunteers.
Bill Hitchin was the local plumber and captain of the rifle club at Gilgandra, and he and his brother Richard came up with the idea of having a recruitment march from Gilgandra to Sydney as a means of raising men to join the men fighting at Gallipoli. On Sunday, the 10th of October 1915, the Cooey March left Gilgandra with 25 men, and by the time they got to Sydney, they'd accumulated 263 recruits.
We're into the 5-year centenary of Anzac, and this is the centenary of the Cooey March. So the plan is we're going to retrace as close as possible the original route, stopping at all of the towns and villages that were originally stopped at. For this reenactment, we have about 40 people who will be marching all the way. Young people from 18 years of age up to the oldest is about 74. Male, female, it's a good cross-section of the community.
William Alston was a 23-year-old labourer who was born at Walgett and joined the Cooey March at Gilgandra. He wrote a letter to a friend in Wellington.
We are having the time of our lives everywhere along the track. The people had most magnificent spreads. I myself have had good times in Gil, but nothing to compare with this. We Gill boys have our lips nearly kissed off by the girls. We have got so used to it that we kiss married women and all.
It's a great opportunity for the small rural communities to celebrate. It's the only real connection at the community level between some very small communities in the bush and the Great War.
The Cooies served in the Western Front in France and Belgium. They were mostly in the infantry, pioneers and artillery, and there was some also in the light horse in Egypt and Palestine. Stanley Everard Stevens was a 24-year-old journalist. He joined the Cooie March at Gilgandra. In February 1917, he wrote a letter which described his first baptism of fire of going into the German trenches.
Somebody said, "Now." There was a bustle and I found myself up in no man's land, jostling someone to get around a shell hole. Everything could be seen as clear as day. The line stretched out right and left. We crouched in our advance, moving slowly, picking our way, with shells shrieking over us and bursting only a few yards in front of us.
As we move along the track, in a lot of cases the original halls are still there. In some cases we have to camp in the bush, so we'll be out under the eucalypt trees. Basically, as close as possible, we'll camp and live the way they did 100 years ago.
Donald Stewart was one of the Cooies who joined the Cooie March at Wellington. He was one of the youngest Cooies, only being 16 and 9 months old at the time. He was taken a prisoner of war in the Battle of Fromelles in France.
Dearest Amy, my love, I'm getting on better than I thought I would in our new life. We are just getting our parcels from the Red Cross. They send us clothes and overcoats, smokes and food, and we get along all right. It's getting very cold here now. It'll be snowing next month. I saw a lot of Cooies killed. One of them died in my arms. My nerves were just about gone when I was caught. I believe if I was in it another night, I would have went absolutely mad.
They might not have known each other well at the beginning of the march, but within days they would have formed that mateship bond, and it would have got stronger and stronger as they continued. It's only been 100 years, but if we let our history die, then we will lose a lot of our culture. And we consider ourselves to be a unique culture, the Anzac spirit and everything that goes with it, and knowing how it started during the First World War, it's important that we grab it and we hang on to it.